Yeah, and I think one thing that Ildiko and I have seen is people will start in a community that doesn't have these best practices and norms, and because that was their first experience, that's what they think it's like. And so they'll move on to another ecosystem. And if there isn't anybody else that's able to change, say something different, they'll actually feel as though, they'll take a leadership role and say, well, this is how it's done. It's like, and so they propagate that bad behavior. And it's difficult for communities to succeed in those environments, at least in my experience.
And when you're talking about bad behavior, you're talking about the technical hygiene and the practices, right? You're not talking about people flaming each other. You're talking about
Correct.
something.
I'm talking, yeah, exactly. It's like, I've seen communities where users will come on with no developers and set requirements and expect somebody else to write the code for them that they're going to take and use for free. And that's not the way an open source community works. It's for me, open source is not a end solution. It is a tool. It is a widget into which you build a solution out of. And so, open source being, developed by developers for developers is where I've seen it work well. And there are a variety of ecosystems, like I said, where that hasn't been the norm.
I mean, thinking a bit about that. Yeah, I don't know that I've necessarily got a very clear answer conclusion for you yet, but there will be a lot of requirement coming out of the regulatory approach that we're starting to see from Europe in particular. The US was driving on security. I think I'm glad that they haven't quite got to legislation yet because they're really thinking it through. I'm on the record as not being keen on the CRA, the Cyber Resilience Act. I'm not overly keen on the AI Act. And I'm even less keen on seeing the product liability directive coming down the line in Europe. I think Europe's got it wrong. Doesn't mean it's irreparable, that they can't change things over time, but I think they've got it really wrong in understanding how technology's developed and evolved.
What concerns you most about the CRA? That's sorry to dig in a
Yeah,
little bit there
yeah.
before
I
we
think
go
that,
on.
in the initial draft, I've worked around policy since the 90s. I don't know if that's something that would be obvious because in my legal roles, I've worked on very cutting edge stuff and represented my organizations, my companies, and being part of industry organizations and trade bodies and things, lobbying government around. Back in the 90s, it was the distance selling directive, e-commerce directive. And I always try to take a sort of strategic, big picture view when you look at law in the early stages. When I was looking at the CRA a year ago, one of the three things that really worried me was the fact that they were treating software as a product. Yeah. And software is a service generally in legislation, not a product, not a good. It's not tangible. And it's been treated as a service. And that in many ways allows for it to be a living, not quite breathing, but mercurial thing that flows and changes, right? Which is really important in an open source environment, in my opinion.
Yep. Agreed.
And which creates a lot of good practice, a lot of the bug fixes, the constant, releasing and updating and fixes that you wouldn't have had historically around the proprietary movement you see in the open source movement because of the way that it flows. So I think there's a fundamental shift. I don't know if it's a lack of understanding, but it's a shift that Europe has adopted, which will come into the product liability directive as well as the CRA. And I just think it's wrong. It's an approach of making software a product, and now we see the term manufacturer. I mean, software isn't manufactured. It's just not. And if you try to take things, I think what they've done is they've used first movement, which is a fundamental principle. Now I'm being a boring lawyer. Maybe you can't ever stop somebody being a lawyer. But if you take that free movement, or first distribution of goods and services, free movement of people type approach to software going into Europe, you make the first distributor liable. It may, as it does in the Act, have a trigger on commercialization. So you have to distribute and commercialize to be liable, even if you're doing open source. And I think there's the product piece and this concept of product and manufacturer, and then aligned to that sort of certification and trying to build standards around it and treat it as a thing you can stamp at a moment in time. I think it's just all wrong. And I don't think it will build a healthy digital sector in Europe, which is the goal.
Yeah.
And then I think there's a piece around how difficult it already is to build businesses around your open source innovation and to ensure that you can commercialize. Now, I very much agree that foundations shouldn't be liable for code that's open source. And I think the steward exemption that they've managed to create is a great thing. But I think there's a real problem there where it's going to mean it's very hard to distribute code into Europe that's not in a foundation
Yeah.
unless you are able to take on risk. And again, from a lawyer's perspective, what risk is it's about liability and funds. And the liability, to stand the liability, to be able to be liable for something, you need to have money or access to insurance, and insurance costs, and it's not always available. But what a lot of people probably who listen to this won't understand is that many of the big companies that, you know, Phil, you've worked in, I've worked in, they self-insure. They don't buy insurance. They've got enough money, they can put money in a pot to cover what they estimate their risk could be. And that's all done in a very structured way, but they release the money back if there are no claims, if there's no litigation, which means that it doesn't really cost them over time and they can afford to do that. And that risk management and liability is something that small organizations can't do in the same way. And I think that there will be a net consequence, you know, maybe I'll be wrong, but I think there'll be a net consequence of the Cyber Resilience Act where there is less innovation in Europe. People are reluctant to put their innovation into Europe because it will impact their liability and risk, and that we'll see lock-in become common because it will be the big techs and in particular, the systems integrators, the Fujitsus, the SAPs, the IBMs, the Oracles, who are able to distribute small people's code, small companies, individuals' code into Europe. And it's the lock-in that they're trying to get away from. I think they're actually going to promulgate.
Yeah.
Because people won't be able to take risk on, but those companies will on a sort of aggregated basis. And it's exactly back to where we were around 2010 in the UK. I was on an advisory board in the Cabinet Office when we came up with the UK's open source first strategy, which was intended to remove some of that lock-in. And public sector governments, they use open source, unfortunately, generally to create code that will be recycled and reused, but also to remove lock-in. But that's usually financially driven, which is why I'm saying, unfortunately. I think that's shifting and they're understanding the quality of the innovation and things more now. But there is a real issue here. And I think it is only going to get worse as you see the CRA move to the Product Liability Directive. And I think some of the approaches are also reflected in the AI Act. And it's clearly been done for a reason. I don't know what that reason is. I've not been involved enough, but I do think it's a mistake. And it fundamentally comes back to that single thing, which is recharacterizing software as a product and creators of software as manufacturers or stewards if they've got the foundational carve out. I just think it's wrong.
But yeah, and as we know, the vast majority of open source projects aren't under a foundation. And yeah.
No, and that we're going to have to see a lot of foundations being set up in order to take all projects, because people are not going to be able to manage their software themselves. So I don't quite know how that's going to work. And building foundations isn't easy, and I've always dissuaded people from setting up more, but I think that's going to have to shift. And then you're sort of looking at a problem that's going to be endemic, because when we talk about innovation and we look at how companies are built and scale, they get bought. And they get bought by the big tech companies because they find it hard to innovate, no matter how hard they try with sandboxes. And again, we've been in some of these. It's difficult for them, and they want a healthy pipeline of innovators bringing this stuff out. So it's not good for them either. So I'm not sure, other than possibly the system integrators, who in the ecosystem benefits from this. So maybe they've influenced Europe, I don't know, but I just don't understand who benefits other than them with the changes in the law. I really hope that the UK and others don't follow the same direction. I think there's one other problem with it, which is that historically liability sits with the user. And I'm talking about business users, right? So if I'm a healthcare provider, if I'm a finance provider, I'm regulated. and I've got a whole bunch of laws that whatever digital tools I use, I have to make sure that I'm complying within those tools. If I'm doing general business, I'm not subject to the same regulations. So I'm liable for how I do this. I'll do a contract with whoever provides this for me. If I'm taking open source, I may not have that. I just take it and use it, but I'm responsible for working that out. I'm responsible for curation. If I don't know what I'm doing, I have to buy in skills or I have to contract with somebody else to do it, right? I either get a company or I bring people into my organization. And, generally, I think we're starting to refer to that as curation. There's a shift now where the supplier is liable under the law. And the supplier used to only be liable under the contract, not under law. It'd be the end user who was, the business user who was creating products and using it be liable. And I also think that's wrong. There's no more, it's all right, I'm not going to go. And another thing, but this is really where I think they've got it wrong. And I hope we don't go the same way, because ultimately at the moment, what's happening here is our lawmakers are saying this is really hard with things like AI. We're not quite sure what to do with this. So what we're going to do is we're going to push this out to the Information Commissioner, the Financial Conduct Authority, so that the regulators who do that regulatory stuff here are making regulations so it stays the same way, where it is the end user and just not the commercial supplier of software who's liable. Now, some of that will be passed back to the commercial suppliers in their contracts, but without a contract, it doesn't get passed back. Now, the key to that is money changes hands. So if you're expected to be liable, you are definitely going to be paid for that liability. And I don't think that's what's going to happen in Europe. I don't think that's the way the landscape plays out. You might be making some money in your software because you're providing services and things, but it's not the same scale as you would be if you had a proper commercial contract to do a big, proprietary distribution or something.
Right.
So it's difficult. Yeah. Is that really tedious? Sorry. I saw the lawyers speak. That's why you don't have lawyers on the show very often.
No, it's not a perspective that I've heard.
I think there's one of the problems we've got is policy and open source, right? Because suddenly it's so important in our digital infrastructure that all the governments rightly are starting to go, okay, so what do you mean? The two guys and is it two, or a person in Nebraska? A person in Nebraska is responsible for this and it's holding up the whole world. How does that work? We have to fix this. And they're just trying to get their heads around it, which is absolutely fair and reasonable. And they need to manage somewhere, because somebody somewhere is going to be liable. That's life. That's how, so that's how the landscape works, because it's business. But it's who should be and how they should be and what's appropriate and how you manage that needs to be worked out. And for the open source communities, there's a problem because the foundations, dealt with the CRA and really led a lot of the challenge. And they've managed to get a steward concept, which I'm really pleased about. But it doesn't necessarily seem to me like the individual developers who commercialize and small businesses or innovators who are going to grow the next HashiCorp and grow a big business. It doesn't seem to me like they're that anybody's really represented them well in this conversation. Right. Yeah, and there aren't enough people. It's the people who understand it work in the big companies and can't do this. So people with my skill set would generally be in, a big tech company or a commercial organization. They wouldn't be representing the open source development community or the SMEs. And I don't know how we shift that. And ultimately, rightly, the foundations will have to, protect their own interests versus those. So there needs to be a way, and I don't know the answer yet, that we do what we've done for Open UK by creating sort of a policy-focused organization that's broad, that also brings together the community. But we need to think about how we do that on a more global basis.
A larger scale, yeah.